Welcome to another episode of Decentralized Revolution, a podcast from the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus and Mises PAC. I'm Liam McCollum, and I'm your host for today. And in this episode, I'm interviewing my friend Benjamin Seevers. Benjamin is a Mises Institute fellow and holds a BA in economics from Grove City College. He will begin his PhD in economics at West Virginia University this fall, and his interests include private governance, public policy, and libertarian ethics. We cover a wide range of topics in this episode. I really hope you enjoy it. And here's my episode with Benjamin Seevers. Well, thanks for joining me. I just saw you at Mises U a couple of weeks ago, and we've been friends for a while now. I first met you at, I think it was the Young Americans for Liberty conference 3 years ago. Was it? Yeah. And then now this was your second time at Mises U, and it was my third. So it was good to see you. And obviously, you're also a member of the Mises Caucus. We saw each other at the Reno conference or Reno convention, and kind of wanted to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to our audience and talk about some of your articles, because you're very prolific. I mean, you're talking about a lot of economics issues, talking about history and the Soviet Union. So, but before that, why don't you just introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah. My name is Benjamin Seevers. I graduated from Grove City College with a degree in economics and a minor in philosophy. I'll be starting my PhD week actually at West Virginia University, PhD in economics. I was involved in the Mises. I'm involved in the Mises Caucus in the Libertarian Party. I was elected as a local government councilman, borough councilman in Pennsylvania, my home state, my town of North Apollo. And I was the one elected libertarian on a board of a mix of Democrats and Republicans and one independent, I believe. And they're all kind of on the same boat. They're more Republican. It's a very red area. I push for a lot of privatization policies. And I've since stepped down from that role because I'm going to be moving to Morgantown, West Virginia. So I wouldn't be able to maintain an active presence on the board, to keep them in line. I wouldn't be able to do that. So
yeah, I'm wondering how effective you were. I mean, were the Republicans, entertaining a lot of your ideas? Were they willing to meet you where you were on a lot of these ideas, or were these more moderate Republicans? Because here in Montana, there's actually quite a bit of Republicans that I would say are libertarian, and that's one of the strategic problems that we have to get over is these people are already basically libertarian. They just call themselves conservatives. They identify with the Republican Party just on a cultural level because, their grandfather was a Republican and basically that's where it starts. So I'm wondering if it's a similar dynamic where you're at, or if these are more like the kind of moderate Republicans that might as well be Democrats.
Yeah, it of course varies. Our county party has had some Republicans come to the meetings at certain points in time, and some of them are very libertarian people. Some of them ran for school board as Republicans and said, "Well, I agree with you guys, and I'd appreciate your support if you could give it to us." But in my specific situation, the Republicans were very averse to the stuff I was saying. Near the end, though, the people in the audience, so to speak, they became more receptive to my ideas. Of course, not entirely on board, but I think that me getting involved kind of threw the rock upside down and revealed all the stuff happening. Like, people just vote for stuff and they don't know what it is, and I kind of criticized that. Nobody really had any justification for anything they were doing. The Republicans on the board never really warmed up to me. There was one who was kind of supportive to privatizing trash collection, but ended up not voting for my bill to do so. But I wouldn't say I was effective at getting legislation through. More challenging the status quo and making it more difficult for them to just easily do things. At one point, I kind of just opposed the adding of stop signs in town, which is a small thing, but I mean, I think it kind of gave a sufficient amount of pushback to where it didn't end up happening. But then they just put stop lines on the road. They painted these white lines for whatever reason, and it apparently like give people a heads up. It's like, come on, people driving around town are not going to like. They're not going to be a stop line is not going to help them stop. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, stuff like that. I kind of also attacked a organization we wanted to join, like a statewide, like I'm not statewide, a multi-borough municipality like organization. I stopped us from joining that just by kind of researching it and presenting some information. So it's minor wins, but not entirely ineffective.
I'm wondering what is the worst policy that you saw get through during your tenure?
Oh, well, there's not a whole lot of change, but there was this grant that we signed, and part of the grant had I didn't vote for it, but part of the grant, one of the conditions was that the agreement could be altered by the state or county at any time for any reason. So, pretty much we're handing the state and county a blank check when it comes to our rights.
Yeah.
But at first it was voted against. We all voted against it, and I was like, "Oh, nice." But the second time around, someone from the county came to convince us to vote for it, and everyone just changed their minds because they saw the pushback the public gave them. And I tried to question this county representative, and I was just kind of stonewalled. Like they didn't want me to ask them questions. So I ended up being the only one to vote against it. So everyone voted against it the month prior. Then the month later, everyone voted for it except me. So that was the most asinine thing I've ever seen in government so far. Like they didn't give a reason, they didn't argue, they just did it because they got to push back.
Do you see a lot of like outside lobbying, like a lot of because my only experience in politics thus far is I was a lobbyist during the legislative session, so I got to see the inner workings of state politics. But I'm wondering if the same thing happens at the local level.
Not so much. It's a smaller government body. A lot less happening. As I said, there's not a whole lot of change. But around the time when there are contracts up for grabs, like the trash collection contract, there were two companies that put in a bid, and one of them came to answer questions, and they gave assurances, verbal assurances to some of the council members, and I voted against it. But it could come back to bite them. I don't know. But there's some services that just aren't bidded, like nobody puts bids in for, like the police contract. We contract out our services to other municipalities nearby. So the police services we contract with a municipality called Kiski Township. They're the only people that put in a bid. So there's not a whole lot of crazy backroom deals, that, at least as far as I'm aware of. Yeah.
In Pennsylvania, is it does the state define a lot of the local powers? Like in Montana, for instance, the trash collection licensing board is basically a state program, and then the localities seem to enforce that. But then we also have a lot of Republicans that are, they're very sound when it comes to the principles of like free markets, and they want to like pass state policies that would basically bar localities from, continuing these programs. So it's very top down, but also libertarian. So I'm wondering if you have a similar dynamic.
Yeah, there is something called the Sunshine Act. I believe that's what it's called, which prohibits council members or prohibits board members on local governments it prohibits them from going out and soliciting people to put in bids. So when trash collection came around and when the police contract came around, I could not legally go out and solicit other boroughs or private companies to provide these services to put in a bid. I could not do that.
Yeah.
So I see that and I'm like, well, the people who are most likely to be energetic about these issues are probably the people sitting on the board. So by passing this law, you're basically like nullifying any action that the that the
Right.
individual board members could take. Who are they going to be the people who are most inclined to look into and try to find people to put in bids? But other than that, there aren't really restrictions on who we choose for trash collection. There's no top-down regulation for that coming from the state. Police, I don't think there is either. It used to be that boroughs didn't have to provide police, and they could just rely on state troopers for police assistance. But I think since then it's changed to where if you don't provide police of your own in your borough, then the state troopers are going to fine you basically for all the calls they get. So I've been told mixed things about that. So but I'm no longer in there. So and the police contract is going to be in a couple years from now, I think. So it wasn't something that was really on my radar yet. So there's a lot of relatively more freedom for boroughs, unless they get themselves into some multi-municipality agreement, which has been starting to happen lately with police mergers or municipality mergers or land banks, which are basically these organizations that are set up by municipalities to buy blighted property and land and revive them, which Pittsburgh's been doing that, and it's been a utter failure.
And my guess is the definition of blight is probably pretty broad, right? That's a problem that we have in Montana, is that this is where we see the cronyism at the local level. There's like a checklist of conditions that you need to meet 3 of them in order for a district to be considered blighted. But one of the points on this checklist is that you don't meet any other condition on the checklist. So it's basically like a get one free. So it's pretty broad. And we see pretty rich neighborhoods are considered blighted. And then we're seeing like big companies come in and they're getting government money essentially to build like theaters or malls and stuff like that. Yeah.
And as one of my articles noted, the malls, they're not exactly good investments. Like a lot of boroughs, they provide subsidies for them. For one example, I wrote an article on a mall that was built out toward Pittsburgh, called Pittsburgh Mills Mall. Yeah, I think it was in Fraser Township, and they provided all types of tax incentives for them, and it ended up just failing. And the mall still owes taxes to the borough. A lot of them, in fact. I think it went up for auction a while ago, and it was sold. The whole mall was sold for $100. Now it's going up for auction again. So it's just been an utter failure, and that's not the only mall that's in that situation. But usually the stuff that's built on these properties are not exactly beneficial to anyone. Just kind of monument building.
I want to get into that article in a second. But before that, how did you get introduced into libertarianism? Like what? We're both about the same age, but we were fairly young for the Ron Paul campaigns, and anyone older than us, that's the typical story. So I'm wondering what happened to you and what first captivated you about these ideas.
Yeah, the stuff on Ron Paul came later, like after I was already introduced. But
same here.
I kind of started with finding out Donald Trump. I went to a Trump rally in Pittsburgh, and that's what got me interested in politics. This is back 2015, I think. And, I was pretty young. I was born in 2001, so I was like 14 or 15 or something like that at the time. And I got interested then, and I got interested in conservatism. And then during a Ben Shapiro podcast, he recommended Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And on the way to the March for Life one year, I read that like cover to cover in like a day, and I was sold. So I went from there, and I read Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman and Denationalization of Money by Friedrich Hayek. And that one really got me thinking, because I'm like, well, here's this thing, money. I never even questioned it, where it came from. Like I never even thought about it. And now here's someone telling me that government doesn't need to be involved in it. So, I was like, what else should government not be involved in?
Yeah.
So I kind of delved into the anarchist literature with Bruce Benson's Enterprise of Law, Gustave de Molinari, Power and Market, by Rothbard. What else? Various things like that, like David Friedman's work.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what catapulted me into it. I was kind of I was involved with some Republican campaigns, and then I kind of just dropped that. And that's when I went to the Libertarian candidates, because especially in PA, the Republican Party is just terrible. Like, so
Yeah.
their choices for statewide candidates are terrible, and their actions on the state legislature have not historically been great for liberty. We have one of the highest gas taxes in the country, a gas tax per like dollar in the country, and that came from a Republican administration, and like someone at a state rep that claimed to be like pro-liberty libertarian. So
right.
it's not really promising here in PA with Republicans. Things have been changing, of course, but that's what kind of drove me to the Libertarian movement, Libertarian Party, seeing the failures of the conservatives and the Republicans and being introduced to these economic concepts early on.
Yeah, it's funny to hear that Hazlitt was your introduction. I was also a Ben Shapiro listener, and there's a picture of me. I actually wore a Donald Trump mask to my high school and won the costume contest. And it's hilarious that we both came from that background. And I wonder if it was Ben Shapiro who recommended that book, and that's why I read it. It might have been why I had it on my reading list. But yeah, I read that book, and then obviously I discovered Ron Paul and the Fed shortly after, and that's kind of the rabbit hole. But so you mentioned this article. It's about malinvestment and these empty malls and shopping centers. And I mean, in every major city, it seems, across the country, there are these empty shopping malls. So what are the insights you learned from local government as to why this is happening, and how does malinvestment play into it?
So yeah, there's kind of two sides of the mall issue. One's, a lot of these malls are built during times of booms. So some malls were built during the housing boom, which I believe the Fraser Township Mall, the Pittsburgh Mills was built. They started construction, and they took out the loans during the housing boom, prior to the crash. So that itself kind of, I think it is probably the catalyst. What happens after that is, the local municipalities are they're looking at how promising these malls apparently are. The decreasing of interest rates, and it signals that these projects are much more beneficial than they actually are going to be much more profitable than they actually will be. So these municipalities see that, and they're like, all right, we got to pour money into this. We got to give them tax incentives and so on. So they entered a tax agreement with this mall. And as I said from earlier, it's still, they owe taxes to the municipality because it was not successful. Surprise. And funny, they had this plan to do all types of crazy stuff. They wanted to put a water park in next to the mall. They wanted to put a NASCAR track there, and none of that came to fruition. And today, it's like, I think it's below 50% capacity. Like they have all their storefronts are empty, and it's just insane. And there's a few other examples. There's some malls in China that were constructed during their boom, and now they're ghost malls, even worse than the one I was describing. Nobody goes to those, and it's completely empty. You see tumbleweeds blown about. Then there's remember Dr. Rittenhour gave me the example of the Mall of the Bluffs, which also was, I think that was constructed during a boom in the 80s. Yeah, I think that sounds right. 70s. But today it's the same issue with them. Empty. It was a bad investment. And I had in my at Apollo, a neighboring town. I live in North Apollo. There's Apollo, separate towns. They tore down the old districts, the old business district, which had some older buildings, and I think they used a government program to build these kind of like a plaza with joined together businesses and so on, kind of like a strip mall. Not really. It's kind of the same deal. And again, you look down there, there's empty storefronts, and It's gotten a little better recently, but it just was it all these government programs just lead us to make suboptimal decisions that are not actually in our best interest, and decisions that will actually not pay off in the long run, decisions that will have to be liquidated in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, there's obviously an interplay between all of these different programs at various levels of government as well. Like inflation is, and the business cycle is absolutely at the center here.
Yeah.
But then you have these blight programs, right, where the local governments are actually contributing money, maybe sometimes, and helping out with these contracts. And all of that distorts behavior and separates it from the real free market that is, tied down by the profit and loss system. So there's kind of, they're having this hallucination effect by government money.
Yeah.
And it's really unfortunate. But for our audience who maybe aren't that familiar with malinvestment and the concept of the business cycle, why don't you just pick that apart? What is malinvestment? What does Austrian business cycle theory have to say about malinvestment, and why exactly is this happening?
Yeah. So, I mean, in a fiat market, in a fiat money economy, we have these certificates that the government prints off, and we use that as money. And at any certain point, there's going to be a limited amount of resources, and that's going to command a specific interest rate, or that's going to at least determine a specific interest rate. And, it's basically like it's involved in the production structure. So, it's a difference between profitability amongst earlier and later stages of production. But when the government introduces more money into the economy, into the loanable funds market, into the banks and so on, banks can lend them out. It suppresses the interest rate, and it gives people the illusion that there's more scarce resources out there than there actually is. So that leads them to start processes of production that inevitably cannot be finished. They cannot be finished because there are not scarce resources available to finish them. So eventually, at a certain point, you run out, and then you're forced to liquidate. You can't finish the production process, so you're forced to liquidate. And there's specific assets which, say you're in the I don't know, the coconut industry or whatever, and you're skinning coconuts, and there's a machine that skins coconuts. Cigar is a better example. Cigar rolling machine. Say there's a cigar rolling machine that's not going to be easily liquidated. You're gonna be screwed at the end of the day. You're gonna have to hold on to it because nobody's gonna want to buy it because it's a specific production good. So, but other things would have to be liquidated, and they fall in price, and they go to different industries that can be better used in. So that's kind of the idea of miss out. It's not like some people try to say it's an overinvestment theory, like the Austrian business cycle theory. They try to say it's an overinvestment theory, but no, what is overinvestment relative to what? I mean, it's a malinvestment theory of the business cycle. People are investing in the wrong things. That's what it is. It's not. Because some people like Snowden and Vane and Modern Macro, this book I have over here, it's a more of a mainstream. They describe it as an overinvestment theory, I believe, and it's just not. That's just not accurate.
Yeah, the story that really helped me understand this was Rothbard's example of the master builder in America's Great Depression. The idea that when the government, they inject money into the market, the master builder actually believes that he has more scarce resources to build, more intensive products.
Yeah.
So in the case of these malls, these builders might be persuaded by it, where they think that instead of building a, just one store, and then like leasing this out to, just one company or whatever, they're like, oh, well, we actually have enough scarce resources here to build a mall. And, but then obviously they have to liquidate, and then these malls or these shopping centers are actually more difficult to liquidate and sell to people. Like what are you going to use a large building for? And the same problem is seen in like China, as you said, with these skyscrapers. It's hard to liquidate that. Like, why would you need a extremely tall building for anything other than office spaces or housing. So yeah, I would highly recommend that book. America's Great Depression by Rothbard was very influential on me.
Yeah, and in that book, he talks about the ghost towns out west that were built during the prior to the Great Depression, and because the crash, and that not because of the crash, but the crash led to them having to liquidate those assets, and of course you have these shelves of buildings, and like, what are you going to do with them? Who's going to buy them? So they just kind of sat there and languished. You saw the same thing with hotels being built prior to 2008. Same thing happened, crash, never finished. I'm sure they're still there. And but the master builder example, that's a pretty good one. I think Mises originated that. Dr. Jonathan Newman he gave a Mises U lecture on that. If anyone, I know you were there, if anyone's interested in that, they should check out that lecture, because he gives a pretty good description of how it works.
Was that the Austrian business cycle theory lecture?
I believe
link
so.
that in the description. Okay, yeah.
I believe so. Yeah.
Jonathan Newman. I'll definitely link that in the description, and everyone should check that out. It's Newman's one of my favorite lecturers at Mises U. Yeah, he's one of the best speakers, I think. But also, so you wrote another article here about local municipalities and whether they should default on their debts. And libertarians make this argument for the national debt. And I was very pleased to see this article by you, because I've never really thought about local debt. And obviously, local taxes are the burden that most people, I think, feel. Yeah. I mean, especially when it comes to property taxes. So what's your argument that you make in that article?
Yeah, so there's a basic argument against government debt, and it's that it's not of the same class as private debt. Private debt, I agree to be loaned money, and in exchange for I'll pay the principal plus interest in the future, and that's a completely legitimate obligation, and that's fine. But here's the problem: the people taking out these loans are not using their own credit. They're not using their own. They're not going to be paying back in their own money. They are taking out these loans from they're issuing bonds. That's how they do it. They issue bonds, and they're paying back in other people's money. They're paying back in money that not just given to them; it's stolen by them from the taxpayer. That's where it's coming from. So and plus the people that buy these bonds, the people who are issued these bonds, they know where the money is going to be coming from. People who buy these bonds know where the money's coming from. So they know it's coming from people who are being stolen from. Whether they see it as stolen or not, that's what it is. It's being stolen from. And municipalities do this a lot. They issue their municipal bonds, and it's usually to finance some project. Like here in we had a sewage connection here in North Apollo, and that's what the bond was. The bond was issued to a company, and we pay them so much a year through basically forcing people to pay them. So that's what we have here. The school districts do this too. Every local government does it, and it's no different. Like, it's morally no different from when the national government does it. And the national government debt should be defaulted on, and I think Peter Klein has an article about that. Rothbard has an article about that, and that's pretty common. That's a pretty common libertarian position. I don't think all libertarians would have that. I think that'd be pretty common in our circles. But why not apply to the local governments as well? They can default on their debt, and they have. And I give a list in the article. I wouldn't be able to list off all the places it talks about, but there's a list of that I think it's updated annually of local governments that default on their debt and what happens. So I mean, what's going to happen is your municipality is going to take a huge hit on their credit. They're not going to be able to take out loans as much anymore in the future. Now, someone mentioned also that, yeah, sure, you might be limited in the present, but I mean, come on, people later on, people can take out loans using the government. It might be even worse because they might only accept a high interest rate, so you'd be paying a higher interest rate. But even then, that's like, it's going to be adding a stress to the government official. They're going to have to justify taking out this massive loan Whereas if in the case in which you didn't default on the debt, they'd have to justify a lesser amount. So I mean, it's a limitation. It's not permanent, because it can be fixed by the government. They can pay back the loans. They can partial default. They can just take out a loan with a higher interest rate in the future. But regardless, it's still a limitation, and I'd say it's a beneficial thing, and every municipal government should do it immediately. I don't know what the effect of that would be amount immediately. A lot of people who hold those municipal bonds would be in for a hurt. But I know the Federal Reserve, I think during 2020 and onward, they bought municipal bonds. So I mean, you might just only be hurting them.
Well, you've also made the case that it's not just libertarians that have held this position that government should default on their debt. I was surprised to find out that socialists also at one point believed this. What was their argument? How do they justify that?
Yeah, so they kind of lumped, and of course their arguments are never very sophisticated, and we're not coming from the same perspective on things. But they lumped Lenin in his writings, that he lumped the people who own government bonds, like treasury bonds and so on, in with the capitalist class, the bourgeois, like the bourgeoisie, like that's who he lumped them in with, and basically every payment, every extraction of resources from the people that pays off these debts is basically a exploitation of the worker, exploitation of the taxpayer, and that's a pretty libertarian position. I mean, sometimes a broken clock is right twice a day.
Yeah.
But that'd be probably a common position amongst the classical liberal class theorists like Charles Dunoyer, Charles Comte, people like them. So that's kind of being influenced by. That's somewhat of a libertarian influence, perhaps, on the Marxists. I think Karl Marx was influenced by them. I believe Ralph Raico has a paper on that, drawing a connection between the classical liberal class theorists and the Marxists. But that's how they justify the default. And in practice, communist governments do that all the time in history. I think I made the point that Mao's government defaulted on imperial debt. Lenin's government, they defaulted on Tsar bonds, which, funny enough, Murray Rothbard bought a lot of Tsar bonds because he thought they'd be like the contract would be eventually honored. But the day he bought them, apparently the day after he bought them, they were delisted from the market.
Wow,
so it was a pretty bad investment. And Joanne Rothbard talks about that in the introduction to the Irrepressible Rothbard, the collection of his Rockwell Report essays. So this is a funny piece of history right there. But Castro's government defaulted on their bonds as well. It's a pretty common thing for them to do. And of course, I don't think they're always doing it because they're dedicated to these principles. I mean, they're doing it out of like it's a practical measure. Like, why would a communist government want to be obligated to pay off the bonds of that are taken by a capitalist government? Like and of course they can do it. I mean, they're pretty revolutionary. Of course, that's not the only thing we've heard they've done. So I imagine that it wouldn't take much convincing for them to do it. Today, they're not as they're even less sophisticated today in their justifications for things. Just look at Bernie Sanders, and but they're definitely not going to do that because it does have strong negative connotations. So that's all that matters nowadays, I guess.
I'm wondering if you found in researching for this article if they ever connected the problem of the debt to central banks, and if those specific socialists that you mentioned had any criticisms of the central bank, because my instinct is that, as you said, it's not necessarily a sophisticated argument, and they're not coming from principle. They might support central banks and inflation when it's practical, and they might support abolishing the debt when it's practical.
Yeah. Now, in Marx's manifesto, he does say he wants to centralize credit.
Yeah, exactly.
And what's his face? Proudhon wanted to create a central bank as well using taxation, and he was kind of like a left-wing, left anarchist. So they're not. I don't think they're averse to the idea. More research on that would have to be done, because I'm not sure what the Marxists would have to say. And in the article, I found a lot of quotes, and especially after the Russian Revolution, talking about the debt in Lenin's collected works. So he got more involved in politics. He's learning what all the issues are. So he's like drumming on this issue pretty hard. But I can't say, because if you've ever looked at the collected works of Lenin, it's like this long. So I can't say.
He had the full collection. It's in the Rothbard Library at the Mises Institute, and it is that long. That's how many books that Rothbard had of Lenin's.
Yeah, but I can't say what his opinions on the central bank were. I imagine I don't know the situation during like Tsar Russia. I don't really know the situation that well regarding a central bank, if they even had one. I'm sure they did, but I'm not sure about that.
So you have another article here that I'm particularly interested in, about the socialists, the Soviet Union, and their treatment of indigenous populations. I have a friend, Ethan Holmes. He was my roommate last year. I've had him on my own podcast a few times, and we've talked about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. He taught a little bit in Siberia. He knows Russian very well. He knows a lot of people in Russia, so I think he's an expert on the topic. And something he always tells me is Russia and the United States, at least their cultures and their population are actually very similar. And part of the similarities have to do with the fact that they both have had to contend with indigenous populations. And we watched a movie called Dursu Usala, I think. It was about this famous indigenous trapper in Siberia. So, what are you talking about in this article? It's specifically about how the Soviet Union treated indigenous people, and I'm wondering, I guess, if it was just the Soviet Union that treated these people poorly, and then also if the Russian governments prior to the Soviet Union treated them poorly.
Yeah. So a little bit of background information. I found this when researching on my project at the Mises Institute this summer on private governments amongst the Eskimo, or the Inuit, as they like to be called. And of course, they're very similar, the Inuit and the Siberian people. I mean, they come from the same, they have the same background, more or less. But I focused on the comparisons between this, like what the Soviets did to them and what the practices of the Siberians were in the article, because I thought it provided a nice contrast. But the abuses went back much further, like 1800s, early 1800s. They invaded Siberia. I'm mainly drawing from one text from this for this information. The Benson Bobrick, that's the guy that wrote the book. I forget the name of the book. I'm sure you could find it. Benson Bobrick. I'm sure you could find it if you search that guy's name. East of the Sun, that's what it was called. So he details the invasion, and they went as far as the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. So the Aleutians are a string of islands between Siberia and Alaska, and they had outposts set up there. I think they had stuff in Alaska as well. They had outposts that would be attacked constantly by Tlingits. They were a Pacific Northwest tribe, and they were relatively anarchic. So they had outposts as far as that place. But a lot of regulation came with the Soviets. So the Soviets, when they got in charge, they were trying to centrally plan their affairs. So they one of their main things was reindeer herding. So the Soviets were trying to impose like command and control, micromanage everything regarding it, but it just horribly failed. And that's primarily because they don't know how it works. How are some bureaucrats in Moscow going to know how to raise and herd reindeer? And plus, they have all these norms and customs and on how to do it and how to exchange and how to cooperate that the Soviets just had no idea about. So they thought that they could just ivory tower intellectual this whole entire thing, and they thought they thought they could manage it just because they have the idea that it's all material processes. So of course we can do it. But in the end, it's like, well, there's also the social component. There's conflict that you have to deal with, and they had a lot of complex customs and norms that they utilized to deal with those things. Someone who commented on the article on Mises fans, he linked, if you know what that is, that's where they comment on the Mises Wire articles now. They post the Mises Wire articles on misesfans.org, and people will comment on them. But someone commented on mine on there with a few documentaries about them, because they knew more about the specific practices than I did. So that'd be an interesting place to check if anyone's more interested in that. They also like eliminated their leaders, their leadership, like the shamans, and there's also decossacization in like, I guess, southern Siberia, like eliminating and driving out of Cossacks. So they horribly treated the Siberians, and they're kind of dealing with that today, as you alluded to. There's government policies and government bodies that are set up to try to help them.
Yeah, I'm wondering if what you learned about the practices of these tribes and the norms, and how, like, why is it that you call it anarchic? And if it was anarchic, did you also see any semblance of private law, or would you call it private law? Were there institutions like that in these civilizations?
So I know more about the Inuit, and they're very similar. So I'll just kind of describe them. I have a paper on this. I'm going to try to get published. They essentially, their leadership structures, they have three different kinds of leaders: the hunting and whaling party leaders. Those are two, and then the headman, and then there's a shaman as well. So the hunting party leaders and the whaling party leaders, and they also go on voyages to the North Pole. They're completely they're completely voluntary. So people who have very good reputations would be leading these parties. And if you don't have a good reputation, you wouldn't be able to command a lot of influence over people. So people naturally followed those who express themselves as good hunters or good whalers, or good at finding their way around the polar regions. So the same people would also act as headmen. So the headman would also kind of mediate affairs, mediate conflict, act as arbitrator sometimes, and house visitors and so on. But same thing, it's voluntary. Those roles are chosen based on reputation. The shaman are a little different because they're mainly physically or mentally disabled. So I kind of explain that in that, well, we see this across most primitive societies. The physically and mentally disabled are shaman fairly often, and this is across space and time. So they're probably the most they have a comparative advantage in providing these. Sometimes they're entertainment or religious services. So and they have a role in enforcing norms. So there's curses and so on that they believe in, and but that stuff is useful. There's a paper on a gypsy law by Peter Leeson, where he talks about their complex set of norms and taboos, and those exist across a lot of primitive societies, including the Inuit. They have taboos. One thing is if you take more than if you continue to eat from collective food storages and or food that's being shared with the tribe, if you continue to eat past what the person wants you to, you're considered a thief. So if someone requests you to stop eating, you should stop eating. That's private property. That's completely private. And a lot of people say, oh, they share everything. They're socialists. No, that's not the case. But basically, people like that could be killed. The thieves could be killed. You see this in Iceland too, like outlaws and people who are just completely like anti private property, thieves. They don't respect people's rights, that type of thing. So they were pretty well enforced. I found that, even despite the condition of sharing that kind of pervaded a lot of these primitive societies. And it was very similar with the Siberians as well. They had sharing norms, and that one things that the Soviets noted was that their norms of sharing were far too generous for socialism to work. So that the sharing, they shared too much. They weren't distributing according to need. That's a key thing for the Soviets and the socialists. You got to from each according to their ability to each according to their need. So like that's right. I mucked that up, but they're far too generous in their sharing. That's one of the problems the Soviets detected.
Well, we've also seen socialists today criticize charity for similar reasons. I'm wondering if you looked at all into Papua New Guinea and their anarchic tribes. I know Bruce Benson talks a little bit about this in Enterprise of Law in the first few chapters. Did you see any similarities between their norms and Papua New Guinea's norms? I know that a similar institution was that if there were any disputes, they almost had like third-party mediators and norms around how disputes would happen. So there was actually somewhat of a ceremony around it where the two parties in conflict would start shouting and screaming at each other, and then people would, come and watch, and then all of a sudden, I don't know if it's like a shaman character or if it was like the leader of the tribe would basically serve as the mediator between these two people. So was there similar tactics, I guess, used by the Inuits?
Yeah, they had something called song duels, which basically what you just described. And I remember seeing something to that extent in Bruce Benson's book. I need to revisit it again, but I was kind of looking at it during the summer, like skimming it again. But yeah, they had what they called song duels, kind of the same thing. The Comanche had that as well, and David Freeman highlights that in his book, Legal Systems Unlike Our Own. But yeah, that's a common thing among natives, Native Americans. But I've not fully explored that. I've mainly looked at the private property aspect, how private was property, and their norms of sharing, and how they prevented people from taking too much, that type of thing, and how they prevented people from taking things that weren't necessarily, which weren't really clear about who owned them. So like they have really specific methods of producing tools and traps and so on that are specific to certain families. So that's how you know if like you're out in the wastes of the Arctic, like on the ice, and you find this trap where you find this meat cache, you'd be able to tell if your brother or sister had made it because it's made in a specific way. So like, when information costs are really high, you can't really tell your family where you're at or where you're going, but they want to share stuff with you. That's good. So like you're going to avoid stealing from somebody and creating a conflict. But one thing that you touched upon with the arbitrators, blood feuds were really big in Eskimo, probably still are pretty big in Eskimo society. But the thing is, unlike Iceland blood feuds, these don't necessarily have to end. So if you kill my father, I kill you, and if you have a son, he's going to come kill me, and then if I have a son, they're going to kill him, and forever and ever. But when the community finds out when something like that is happening, they try to quickly stamp it out because that's very damaging to like the future survival of the tribe. So they usually the headman or some other community members who are known for their good decisions or good judgment calls or whatever characteristic that they find desirable for mediating disputes, they pick them and they establish themselves like we're gonna fix this, we're gonna set this straight, and they try to find some agreement that's good for everybody, some way to stop the conflict. So that's how arbitration works. Song duels were kind of the same way that you described, like you screaming at each other.
Yeah, I think a lot of critics of like libertarian law and anarcho-capitalists, they think, especially the conservative types, think that we are arguing for a lack of hierarchy and a lack of structure altogether. Just the word anarchy reminds them of that. And when if they're hearing this, they might be like, well, how is that any different from government, right? Like what you're describing is government of a certain sort. There's punishment for crime, private property crime, and stuff like that. But I'm wondering if the way you would answer that is to say, well, the key aspect here is that they're recognizing private property, and in that sense, it is also voluntary because it's a part of this community, and it's the proper kind of coercion. It's not coercion in the sense like aggression, where it's coercion when used in an offensive manner. It's to correct wrongs that are done against private property rights, I guess. So I'm wondering how you would answer that criticism.
Yeah, there's a lot that could be said about this. One is if you steal something in a society like this, you're probably either you're gonna be killed or driven out from society. So in Ellickson has this book called Order Without the Law, where he talks about Shasta County, where ostracism plays a major role in Shasta County, California, where ostracism plays a major role in preventing people from slighting people, violating their rights, and so on. Same thing happened in Eskimo or Inuit community, where if someone continuously was a fraudulent character, people just stop trading with them, and they'd be forced to basically go elsewhere, join some other group, or create their own. So those two punishments are way stronger than some of the punishments we have today, such as like Soros-funded DAs who don't really prosecute crimes. And just as long as you don't steal more than $1,000 worth of goods, well, you're in the clear. And the police, the store owner can't touch you, because then they'd be assaulting you. Like that's the society we live in today. And it might be it's a false dichotomy to say, well, anarchy is the only other option, but one's certainly better than the other. I mean, we're going in the direction of progressivism in this country, and anarchy, like private property anarchy, seems like a nice antidote to that. And and regarding the hierarchy point, we obviously don't want to eliminate hierarchy. We're talking about natural elites, natural leaders, and Hoppe talks about that, and it's that is hierarchy. You are obeying somebody above who's much more accomplished or reputable than you, not because you're being forced to, but because it's within your best interest to do so. If you disobey their rulings, well, people will probably trust you less, or people will probably not want to trade with you. So yeah, they're restricted by circumstance, I guess. They're not being forced, and no one's threatening their person or property. No one's violently acting against their person or property to make them obey these rulings. They are kind of, they're goaded to by just desire, like self-interest. But that's not something we should care about. We should care about violations of private property. We don't care if somebody's being let's say somebody doesn't like a ruling, but he obeys it anyway because his reputation be harmed. Sure, he's being compulsed to do so, like he's being compelled to do so, but that's not something we care about. Like we care about private property violations. That's our main value, and people that want to import other values into this debate need to justify that.
Yeah, I think an often neglected argument for libertarianism is that we actually want justice to be more efficient, and people might be surprised by that, where they're like, oh well, the typical, what you would typically expect from like an anarchist, especially of the left-leaning type, is that they hate all authority. They don't want anyone to be able to punish or anything like that. But what we're saying is we actually would like to see, the hammer come down occasionally, and we would like it to be done more efficiently. And Tate Fegley had some pretty great lectures at Mises U about this as well, that, the incentives of government is that they they tend to prosecute crimes like traffic crimes, like speeding, while neglecting serious property crimes like in murder, obviously, and
Yeah.
violent crime. And we would prefer that well, we would say that private law and libertarian law upholds private property rights, and then would obviously on the value scale, speeding is significantly lower. But then, something that I've been saying a lot is the reason that I am a libertarian is not because I hate order or hierarchy. It's because I think that libertarianism and free markets and anarchism actually produce a better status quo, a better order, and more hierarchy. And I think that is an often neglected point, because we often, I think a lot of libertarians try to appeal to egalitarianism. And I think there's a lot of that. I think that's foolish. I think it is really foolish, because it leads down the road of, having to compromise on certain things. And then Tate Fegley has a good article about egalitarianism as, what's it called? It's a play off of Rothbard's egalitarianism as a revolt against nature, but it's egalitarianism as a revolt against safety.
Yeah, that's
and I highly recommend that. Yeah. But we have about 4 minutes left. We might go a little over an hour. I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about your foreign policy positions and some of the work you've done on this. I think the audience might be really interested in that. You kind of made a storm on Twitter during Memorial Day because you said that we should not be celebrating Memorial Day. And it was a very interesting argument. I wonder if you want to summarize that really quick.
Yeah, I was kind of inspired by Rothbard's article on flag burning. I saw that and I'm like, Memorial Day is coming up, so I should do something. I just, people did not like that. But basically the argument is, well, if we want to, and of course people aren't obligated to like not celebrate. You can celebrate Memorial Day. I'm not saying you should be forced to not celebrate it. But if you wanted to create a culture that is discouraging military enlistment, discouraging foreign wars, you shouldn't be venerating the people who go to these foreign wars, the people who enlist. You shouldn't be venerating them. And of course, there's room to lament and about the people that get drafted. And I talk about that in the article. But obviously, people who think I'm some psycho left-winger who hates people because they went to the military, they didn't read the article, because I do have sympathy for these people who are drafted. But unfortunately, we shouldn't be celebrating it, because, well, what's to celebrate about an unjust endeavor? It is not a what did I say exactly? We shouldn't venerate a war. We shouldn't venerate the warriors in said war. We shouldn't, because it's an unjust thing. I mean, if you think it's just, if you're a Republican who wants to just annihilate Iraq, of course they're going to want to celebrate Memorial Day. I'm not saying libertarians should not support Memorial Day. We're against foreign wars. We're against these foreign aggressions. So we shouldn't be immortalizing these people who engage in these aggressions. Because one of the arguments I make is, well, if we stop doing this, it may not be significant enough to discourage people from joining the military or enlisting, but it could on the margin. It definitely wouldn't encourage it. It could on the margin, though, because I remember, like, I'd see Memorial Day parades, Veterans Day parades when I was young, and it is like a magnificent sight. And there are some people who I've read testimonials about this, people who see these things or see some patriotic display, and they're like, oh, I knew that moment right there that I was going to go to the military, that type of thing. So if we stop celebrating it, you're going to decrease you're going to relatively decrease the benefit of actually joining. You're not going to be immortalized. You're not going to be venerated. Your actions are not going to be. Nobody's going to be proud of your actions. Nobody's going to celebrate your sacrifice, because it's not a noble sacrifice at all. It's a vicious one. So that's kind of the point I make. And of course that drew a lot of ire.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you, especially with the background of being a Trump supporter, I'm sure you grew up in a conservative household or conservative neighborhood, and I mean personally, my family, like my grandfather was in the military, and my great grandparents were in the military. I mean, my great grandparents were drafted. My grandpa volunteered to go to Vietnam.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you had a similar perspective where, I mean, I remember like celebrating the dropping of the Moab by Trump. Like,
Yeah, I remember that too. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a big deal. It was like, wow, like we finally have a strong president. That was how I
Yeah.
felt. And I mean, there is something pretty cool about like, this equipment and, the human ingenuity, right? Like there is something pretty cool about the weaponry, and there's an air show in Montana this weekend, and there's been F-16s flying over Montana all day,
Yeah.
and it's fun stuff, right? It kind of something primal about it.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if you think maybe with that perspective in mind, like, is there room to maybe change the meaning of Memorial Day to instead of venerating these people, we mourn these people and talk about them as like, cogs in a machine. The government government uses them as pawns, or do you think that there's somewhat of a personal responsibility that is often neglected by these people, and that they're a participant in this war machine as well? Where do you land on that argument?
So yeah, I can see that, and actually, that's how Memorial Day started. It was originally a spontaneous holiday that people celebrated. Not really celebrated. It was like a mourning, a day of prayer for peace. That's how it started, and I'm for that. I mean, I'm not against that in principle. I think that's a good thing, and that's how it started off. I think after the Civil War, I talk about it in the article. I don't remember off the top of my head when it started exactly, but it kind of it was integrated into law by Nixon. I believe Nixon, by executive order he signed, to establish a national day of prayer, and even that's not too bad. But it's transformed itself into a patriotic display of, we got to honor these people's noble and brave and courageous sacrifices, and that is dangerous. The day of prayer is that's permissible.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. I just want to talk about one more article since we're talking about foreign policy. You have this piece about economic nationalism, and
Yeah.
people often don't connect these two. They don't really understand how protectionism leads to foreign policy. So I'm wondering what the argument is that you make in this. It's titled "Economic Nationalists Are Wrong. Free Trade Means Freedom and Prosperity."
Yeah. So the original title I submitted it under was Contra Anton. And Michael Anton is a national conservative. He's for free trade. He's for trade restrictions. And actually, I saw him again last week. I looked behind me during one of the talks because he was giving a talk on the movie The Godfather. I looked behind me. He's sitting right there. And I'm like, I don't know if I should bring this up to him. But in that it's in response to a debate he had with James Addison, who was a defender of the free market, and Michael Anton never drew the line between prosperity and trade restrictions. He never drew the theoretical line, and when questioned about it, he just dismissed it or made some silly arguments about how people still drive around Italian cars. Well, they don't do it as much as they would otherwise because there's tariffs on them. But that last part was something we said in response to him of how, like, well, he's not thinking on the margin. Tariffs eliminate the marginal consumer of a good, and if sufficiently high, it will eliminate every consumer. But people just won't buy Italian cars. But people do buy Italian cars because there's rich people in this country that can afford them. But people are not buying them in the market quantity, or maybe the tariffs are not sufficient to actually deter any consumption. But it's either going to be ineffective, or it's going to be effective at creating or lowering the quantity consumed. But one of the things I said to him was, and he didn't actually respond to this, was, well, that how you get economic prosperity and growth and development is you have a falling in the amount of consumption and increase in savings and investment. That allows us to have a elongated structure of production and have more consumption in the future. That's how we have economic growth. Tariffs limit that. Tariffs increase prices in the present, and it increases our the amount we spend in consumption in the present. And in the long run, it leads to less economic growth. So there's a theoretical link between, spending and growth. You need less consumption spending to have more growth. And when you increase consumption spending through tariffs or taxes or whatever, you're going to be eliminating future growth and future prosperity. So I drew that connection. That's like the Austrian position, and he didn't care. What he decided to do was kind of invoke the holy word of Alexander Hamilton, who was in favor of trade restrictions to protect infant industries. And it's probably a little more complicated than that, but I'm simplifying it. And when I question him about Hamilton's intentions, because we know Hamilton, thanks to Patrick Newman's work, was a cronyist. And he said, Michael Anton just said, someone looked through his window one time and they saw him hard at work writing, and a hard worker like that is a great guy. He gave me some apocryphal story about Hamilton hard at work writing. Like, how does that defend his character? I'm sure if I had a bunch of money on the line, I'd be a hard worker too. If I had total political power of the United States, yeah, I would be a hard worker. But that's not a good thing. I'm working for a bad end. That's the argument he gave. It's just silly. There's more in the article I wrote on that. But he also claimed that libertarians were pro NAFTA, which he obviously hasn't read Rothbard's articles on NAFTA, which are heavily critical of NAFTA.
Yeah, can you talk about that a little bit? Because I was going to bring up the libertarian position on trade deals. I think there's kind of a tension, or maybe just an apparent tension. When you dive deeper, I don't think there is, but between, like, libertarians always say the argument against protectionism, is that we have more free trade, and the more interconnected countries are, the more peaceful our world's going to be. But then, like, you dive deeper into some of these trade deals, and like Ralph Raico talks about China and how we force these open markets, and that's how the opioid crisis began in China. Mm-hmm. So what is the libertarian position about, like, government enforced trade deals?
Yeah, so, like, usually you don't need a deal to have free trade. Either have unilateral free trade or just mutually agree to lower tariffs. Like, those are the two options. You don't need a 1,000-page document, like, specifying exactly how much of what good will be produced in which country and how much the workers should be paid. Which, funny enough, the USMCA, the I don't know if that's still active, but that was the Trump's trade deal, and that was just chock full of these trade restrictions, quotas, and minimum wages for workers. So, like, that is just completely non-libertarian. Now, it may be the case that the trade, it might be worth it. The trade-offs might be worth it. Like, you might get more economic growth from the additional trade, from the trade barriers being eliminated, than the amount of economic regression from, like, whatever is imposed on the industries. But you're just trading one good for one bad. I mean, you're not comparable. It's going to harm some people and it's going to benefit others. I mean, I'm not for, like, these. I know some libertarians are probably more strategic about this, and I'm more of a purist. Like, I'm not for trading off one person's welfare for another person's benefit, even if, like, there is some seemingly objective measure of which one's going to be a better benefit than the cost than the cost. So in the USMCA also had further IP protections too, which that's a sticky issue with libertarians. But I just don't see the basis in property right ethics for intellectual property laws. So that these free trade laws, include more restrictions on IP. Like, you got to put in so much effort to fight IP violations in your country, that type of thing, and which harms trade. So like Shein recently, are you familiar with Shein? If you have a sister or girlfriend or whatever, I mean, they probably buy clothes from Shein or however it's pronounced. They're being hit with a RICO lawsuit by the United States over their IP violations, and their IP violations involve just them taking like all these like designs that are protected under U.S. law and selling them very cheaply, like selling them on clothes very cheaply. Like that's a good thing for consumers. They can get like a Supreme shirt for $5 or whatever, like a convincing Supreme shirt for $5. I don't know what a convincing Supreme shirt would be, but they can get cheaply. But this RICO lawsuit is going to harm that ability for consumers to be satisfied just to protect some intellectual property interests. So that this free trade laws, these free trade agreements involve stuff like that, involve quotas and involve minimum wages. And Rothbard touches on that a little, but it's only gotten worse since then.
Yeah, well, and I mean, the argument for free trade in the libertarian position, like I summarized earlier, is that the consumers are driving it, the consumers become interconnected, and so on. But the trade deals seem to actually heighten the competitive in the foreign policy perspective, the competitive nature between these countries, because it becomes legalistic, and there are, like you said, quotas, minimum wages and IP protections that must be met. So it seems like the top-down, centrally planned trade deals actually potentially make the risk of war heightened instead of actually intertwining these countries. There's now like a legalistic arrangement between these two countries, and if one side doesn't follow through, then the other side is more likely to go to war with them.
Yeah, that's what's happening with China. Like they're using IP laws, IP law violations as a basis for more interventions, more trade restrictions, and so on. So it does heighten conflict to some extent.
Yeah. And for anyone who's interested in the history of the China and U.S. relations, I would highly recommend you go back and listen to my episode with Joseph Solis Mullen. He's been doing incredible work for the Libertarian Institute and the Mises Institute on Foreign Policy, and I'll link to that video in the description. But thank you so much for joining me. We're 12 minutes over an hour, so I'll let you go. But if you want to just let people know where they can find your stuff, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I have a linktr. I have a link tree now. So I guess linktr.ee /bseevers, SEEVERS. That's where you can find all my links. I have a Mises writer profile as well, so you can find my articles on there, as well as the Libertarian Institute. Those are the two places I publish the most. So, Benjamin, just search my name. Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, there you have it. I'd like to thank Ben for joining me. And as always, thanks to Dave versus Goliath for all the music you hear on Decentralized Revolution, and to our producer, Simon Kalpin. And thanks to all of you who are subscribed to our email list and support the PAC. You can do both of those things at takehumanaction.com. Please remember to like, comment, and share the podcast. And thanks for watching.